Season 2 of the Breakdown Economy showed us what happens when cloud providers fail. AWS, 15 hours. Slack, Atlassian, thousands of services offline. Google Cloud, 7 hours. Gmail, Spotify, billions of users affected. Cloudflare, 2 hours. Massive portions of the internet unreachable. And the standard advice after every outage is the same. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, use multi-cloud. But here's the reality most people don't tell you. Multi-cloud is expensive. Multi-cloud is complex. Multi-cloud requires expertise most companies don't have. And even companies that do multi-cloud right still experience outages when their cloud providers fail. So let's look at a company that actually does multi-cloud at scale, Spotify. They use Google Cloud and AWS and their own data centers. And when Google Cloud went down in June 2025, Spotify still went offline for hours. This is the story of how multi-cloud actually works, what it costs, when it makes sense, and why even companies that do it right can't eliminate cloud dependency risk entirely. Welcome to Season 3 of the Breakdown Economy. I'm Tony. If you watched Season 2, you saw 10 major infrastructure failures. CrowdStrike, AWS, Google Cloud, Cloudflare. Billions of people affected. And after every single cloud outage, my emails fill up with the same advice. Just use multi-cloud. Don't depend on one provider. Distribute across AWS and Azure. This is why you need redundancy. And that advice is technically correct, but economically infeasible for most companies. By the way, listeners, instead of emails, just leave a comment. Here's what just use multi-cloud actually means. You need to build and maintain duplicate infrastructure across multiple providers. You need engineers with deep expertise in AWS and Google Cloud and Azure. You need abstraction layers to make your applications work across different platforms. You need to constantly test failover between providers. You need to pay for resources on multiple clouds simultaneously, even the ones you're not actively using as primary. Let's talk numbers. Single cloud provider, optimized. Let's say $100,000 per month in infrastructure costs for a large organization. Multi-cloud with true redundancy, you're looking at $200,000 to $300,000 per month, plus the engineering cost. You need a dedicated team managing multi-cloud complexity. That's a minimum of 3 to 5 senior engineers at $200,000 per year each, fully loaded. Infrastructure, $2.4 million to $3.6 million per year. Engineering team, $600,000 to $1 million per year. The total, $3 million to $4.6 million per year for multi-cloud, versus $1.2 million per year for a single cloud solution. You're paying 3 to 4 times as much. For most startups? For most mid-sized companies? That's not viable. So, when people say, just use multi-cloud, they're ignoring economic reality. I even find myself, as a technical sales engineer, focusing on providing the right solution to the client's needs rather than on what the optimal solution will cost. And the complexity isn't just about money. AWS calls their virtual machines EC2 instances. Google Cloud calls them compute engine instances. Azure calls them virtual machines. Different APIs, different networking models, different security configurations, different pricing models, different support structures. Building something that works seamlessly across all of them? That's a full-time job. Actually, it's multiple full-time jobs. You need abstraction layers. Tools like Terraform help, but they don't eliminate the underlying complexity. Most companies can't afford this, and honestly, most companies don't need to. But some companies can afford it, and some companies have specific reasons that make multi-cloud not just viable but necessary. Spotify is one of them. And before I continue, I listen to Spotify every day. Spotify has over 600 million users globally, tens of millions of songs, billions of streaming sessions per month, and over $100 million per year in cloud infrastructure costs. At that scale, multi-cloud starts to make sense, but not for the reasons you might think. Spotify's multi-cloud strategy isn't run everything on every cloud provider for redundancy. That would be insane. And impossibly expensive, even for Spotify. Instead, they strategically place different workloads on different providers based on strengths, costs, and leverage. Let's start with history. 2008 to 2015. Spotify runs entirely on their own data centers, physical servers, bare metal, complete control, but massive operational overhead. 2016. They begin migrating to Google Cloud Platform, major multi-year project. Why Google Cloud and not AWS, which had a bigger head start? According to our research, it was data analytics. Google's BigQuery was better for Spotify's massive data processing needs. Machine learning tools, competitive pricing for Spotify's scale, and, this is important, leverage. Spotify was one of Google Cloud's biggest customers. That meant negotiating power. By 2018, most of Spotify's core infrastructure runs on Google Cloud. There are music streaming delivery, user data and playlists, recommendation algorithms, mobile backend services, and analytics and data processing. So Spotify is all in on Google Cloud, right? Not quite. Around the same time, Spotify starts using AWS for specific workloads. For example, podcast hosting and delivery, after acquiring podcast platforms. Some marketing and analytics tools, disaster recovery scenarios, and in geographic regions where Google Cloud presence is limited. Notice something? This isn't redundancy. This is a strategic placement. Spotify isn't running duplicate music streaming infrastructure on both Google Cloud and AWS. That would be a massive waste. Instead, music streaming is Google Cloud, optimized, cost negotiated. Their podcast uses AWS acquired infrastructure, specialized tools. For data analytics, Google Cloud, BigQuery advantage. And their services are spread out over specific regions and services, based on whichever provider is better. This is multi-cloud done right. Use each provider for what they're best at. Where you get the best price, where you have leverage. And believe it or not, Spotify still operates some of their own data centers. Why? If you're paying Google Cloud and AWS, why also run your own hardware? Caching infrastructure. Servers geographically distributed to reduce latency. Cost optimization. At Spotify's scale, owning hardware for certain workloads is cheaper than the cloud. Leverage. Maintaining the technical capability to run your own infrastructure gives you negotiating power with cloud providers. If Google Cloud raises prices 30%, Spotify can credibly say, we can move this workload to our own data centers. That threat has value. So here's Spotify's actual infrastructure in 2026, based on public information. 70% Google Cloud, core streaming, data, machine learning. 20% AWS, podcasts, specialized services, disaster recovery. 10% owned data centers, caching, cost optimization, leverage. This is strategic multi-cloud, not everything everywhere. Specific workloads on specific providers for specific reasons. And it requires a team of over 200 infrastructure engineers to make it work. June 12, 2025, Google Cloud suffers a major outage. Over 7 hours. Null pointer crash in service control. Spotify went down. Even though Spotify uses Google Cloud, AWS, and their own data centers, they still experienced hours of disruption. Why? Because 70% of Spotify's infrastructure, including core music streaming, runs on Google Cloud. When Google Cloud's control plane crashed, Spotify couldn't. Authenticate users, IAM through Google Cloud. Serve music files, storage on Google Cloud. Process recommendations, ML on Google Cloud. And scale services, orchestration on Google Cloud. In this instance, multi-cloud didn't save them, because their multi-cloud strategy wasn't designed for Google Cloud completely fails. Could Spotify have designed their infrastructure to fail over from Google Cloud to AWS during an outage? Technically, yes, Economically, probably not worth it. To have instant failover from Google Cloud to AWS, you'd need duplicate infrastructure running on AWS simultaneously, not just present, actually running, warm, ready to take traffic. For Spotify's scale, that means hundreds of millions of dollars in duplicate infrastructure, real-time data replication between clouds, massive bandwidth costs, constant testing of failover scenarios, and split brain prevention, ensuring both clouds don't think they're primary. Annual cost of true multi-cloud failover, $50 million to $100 million annual cost of a 7-hour outage. Lost revenue, $5 million, rough estimate. User churn, minimal. Where else will they go? Pandora? Not that there's anything wrong with it. And brand damage, short term. The math doesn't work. It's cheaper to accept occasional outages than to build complete cross-cloud redundancy. This is the dirty secret of multi-cloud. Even companies that do it right make calculated decisions to accept single provider risk in specific areas. But here's where Spotify's multi-cloud strategy died work. During the Google Cloud outage, Spotify's podcast infrastructure, which runs on AWS, stayed online. Here's what failed: music streaming, Google Cloud; user playlists, Google Cloud; and recommendations, Google Cloud. And here's what worked: podcast hosting, AWS; some regional services, own data centers; and internal tools, AWS. So multi-cloud didn't prevent the outage, but it did limit the blast radius. Not everything failed simultaneously. And Spotify's multi-cloud expertise meant their engineers understood multiple platforms, could troubleshoot across providers, and had options during the crisis. They couldn't fix Google Cloud. Nobody could except Google. But they could. Route some traffic to AWS where possible. Use their own data centers for caching. Communicate clearly about what was down and why. And recover quickly once Google Cloud came back. That's the real value of multi-cloud at this scale. Not preventing outages, managing them better. All right, let's get practical. Should your company use multi-cloud? Here's the honest framework. Multi-cloud makes sense when, if you're spending $10 million per year on cloud infrastructure, multi-cloud negotiations can save you millions. You have leverage with providers. Below that threshold, a single provider with good architecture is probably fine. Spotify, $100 million plus per year in cloud costs. Multi-cloud makes sense. Typical startup, $50,000 per year. Multi-cloud is overkill. 2. You have genuinely different workloads with different optimal platforms. Spotify's music streaming is optimized for Google Cloud's data tools. Podcasts work better on AWS for legacy reasons. So if everything you run works equally well on any provider, there's no reason to spread across multiple. Don't use multi-cloud just to use multi-cloud. Use it because specific workloads genuinely benefit from specific providers. 3. You need negotiating leverage. The credible threat of moving workloads gives you pricing power. Google Cloud wants to raise prices? We can move this to AWS. AWS being difficult on support? We have other options. But this only works if you've actually built the capability to move workloads. Empty threats are worthless. 4. You have regulatory or data sovereignty requirements. Some countries require data to stay in country. Not every cloud provider has data centers everywhere. Some industries have regulations about not having all data with one provider. For financial services, healthcare, and government, sometimes multi-cloud isn't a choice. It's a regulatory requirement. But multi-cloud does not make sense when you're doing it for redundancy without understanding the cost. True cross-cloud failover is monumentally expensive. If you can't afford to run duplicate infrastructure simultaneously, you don't have real redundancy. You lack the engineering expertise. Multi-cloud requires deep knowledge of multiple platforms. If you're struggling to manage a single cloud provider, adding a second won't help. You're relying on cloud-agnostic tools to hide complexity. Kubernetes, Terraform, and other tools help, but they don't eliminate the underlying differences between providers. Each cloud has unique services, pricing models, networking quirks, and failure modes. Abstraction layers can't fully hide these. You haven't mastered single cloud first. If your infrastructure isn't well architected in a single cloud, spreading it across multiple clouds just distributes your problems. Here's the uncomfortable truth. A well-architected single cloud deployment is more reliable than a poorly architected multi-cloud deployment. Focus on proper testing and staging, good monitoring and observability, clear failure modes and recovery procedures, and of course, regular disaster recovery drills. Do that on one cloud provider first. Then, if your scale and needs justify it, consider multi-cloud. For most companies, startups, mid-sized businesses, even many large enterprises, the right answer is pick one primary cloud provider. Architect your systems well on that provider. Have a disaster recovery plan. Understand your dependencies. And accept that sometimes your cloud provider will have an outage. You'll be down for hours. That's the trade-off for not spending millions on multi-cloud infrastructure. Is that acceptable? For most companies, yes. For Spotify with 600 million users and over $100 million in cloud costs, they can afford better, and they've built it. But that doesn't mean you need to copy them. So, what are the actual takeaways from Spotify's multi-cloud strategy? Lesson 1. Multi-cloud is strategic placement, not redundancy. Don't run everything everywhere. Run specific workloads on specific providers for specific reasons. Cost optimization, technical capability, regulatory requirements, negotiating leverage, not redundancy for redundancy's sake. Lesson 2. Scale changes. The math. At $10,000 per month in cloud costs, multi-cloud is probably a waste. At $1,000 per month in cloud costs, multi-cloud negotiations can save you more than the costs of complexity. Know where you are on that spectrum. Be honest about whether you're at the scale where multi-cloud makes economic sense. Lesson 3. Even multi-cloud can eliminate dependency. Risk Spotify uses Google Cloud, AWS, and their own data centers. And when Google Cloud went down in June 2025, Spotify still experienced significant outages, because true cross-provider redundancy is economically impractical, even for companies with over $100 million infrastructure budgets. The real problem, and we covered this extensively in Season 2, is infrastructure concentration. 3 companies control 67% of global cloud infrastructure. When they fail, massive portions of the internet fail with them. Multi-cloud for individual companies is a band-aid. It doesn't solve the systemic problem of too much infrastructure depending on too few providers. We'll explore that more in later Season 3 episodes. Lesson 4. Better single cloud beats half-hearted. Multi-cloud. If you can't afford to do multi-cloud right, and most companies can't, focus on doing single cloud well. Good architecture, proper testing, monitoring, disaster recovery planning, incident response procedures. Those things matter more than spreading your infrastructure across multiple providers without the resources to do it properly. Spotify can afford over 200 infrastructure engineers managing multi-cloud complexity. Can you? Multi-cloud is a tool. Like any tool, it's useful for specific jobs at specific scales. Spotify uses it strategically. They place workloads where they make sense. They maintain leverage with providers. They accept calculated risks. That's multi-cloud done right. Next episode, chaos engineering. Netflix deliberately crashes servers during business hours, on purpose, to find weaknesses before production finds them. It's how they stay online while competitors fail constantly. That's next week on The Breakdown Economy. I'm Tony. Build strategically, scale intelligently, accept calculated risks. And remember, multi-cloud isn't a silver bullet. It's expensive, complex, and even companies that do it right still experience outages when cloud providers fail. Choose your battles. Know your scale. Architect well whatever you choose.